Last time on the channel, we looked at 3 different Ludwig acrylite shells in various states of disrepair. While they were mostly in pretty good shape, there were still some pretty deep scratches and imperfections on most of the shells. This was an unsettling itch that I just couldn't scratch, and it bothered me immensely to say the least. This led to a Google and YouTube rabbit hole that ended up bringing me to a video on alcohol inks. Feeling a little adventurous, I decided to take a risk on a new artistic medium. I'd never heard of alcohol inks before, but after I did a little research, I figured out it was too good to pass up. Alcohol inks are fast-drying, highly pigmented, waterproof alcohol-based inks that can be used on any hard, non-porous surface. This includes glass, metal, plastic, ceramic, stone, leather, and even polymer clay. Once the ink is applied, the alcohol evaporates, leaving the dye behind. Because the ink is suspended in alcohol, this creates really interesting opportunities where different alcohol inks can interact and repel each other based on individual compositions of that alcohol ink. What you end up with is a very lively medium that can produce ridiculously detailed and psychedelic colors with almost little to no effort. Another thing that's interesting is once the alcohol ink dries, it can be re-wet with alcohol and diluted to create unique and versatile effects that can't be achieved with water-based products like acrylic paint. You can even dilute the inks to the point where they simply wash off the surface, allowing you to erase your work and try again if you screw up. Originally, I was surfing YouTube looking for a good way to spray paint metal acrylite shells in order to cover up the imperfections. This was the most familiar method to me, as I had seen it done with varying degrees of success across multiple drum forums and restoration sites before. I was cautious though, because I knew the spray paint would have its own set of challenges, and getting it right without a decent spray gun was going to be tricky. I also knew it was going to be a messy and expensive process. Another thing to consider was that if I messed up, I knew it was going to be tedious to fix the imperfections. There's also the limitation of choice regarding color, and the ease and opportunity to blend different colors together. I'm not an experienced spray gun artist, and rattle cans were my only realistic tool I had to work with. Not great. So after a quick stop at my local Michael's, and a self-administered motivational internal monologue, I decided with newfound boldness in my heart to head back to the workshop and give this a go. In order to help me get into this easier, I enlisted the help of my wife and our good friend Sammy, who had dealt with alcohol inks before in the past. Considering this medium was completely foreign to me when I started, I figured I could use all the help I could get. The first thing we did was wipe the shell off thoroughly with pure alcohol solution. This was to make sure absolutely no residue was left over from the time the shells spent in the workshop. We were also going to use the alcohol a lot during the application as a solvent to suspend the inks, which would allow them to blend and travel. I noticed that the craft store also did sell a blending solution, but we found out after a lot of experimentation that 70% isopropyl alcohol worked pretty much exactly the same. You could go with higher concentrations, but they were more expensive at the drugstore. I will say that the 90% and above concentrations of pure alcohol did dry a lot quicker, but I wouldn't say the difference was a deal breaker. Anyway, onto the alcohol inks themselves. We used a couple of the Tim Holtz brand alcohol ink kits. I went with a mix of blues, greens, and reds, specifically the Rodeo kit with the crimson, aquamarine, and sepia, which I didn't really end up using, and the Farmer's Market kit, which had cranberry, lettuce, and eggplant colors. I will say that for my first time, I found these inks worked really well, and the colors were extremely vibrant and pigmented. The first shell was our prototype. I was pretty nervous at first with everything being so new, but with a little reassurance, we decided to suck it up and go for it. First, we wet the surface with isopropyl alcohol, and then used the dropper to start building up layers of alcohol ink. We applied the ink in thin layers at first, and then added more and more ink with less alcohol blender to concentrate color into different areas. Initially, we focused on small areas at a time, until we became more comfortable and familiar with the way the alcohol inks flowed and interacted with each other. We experimented with letting it blend naturally. Then, we decided to help it along with a brush or different types of tools to help direct the ink into certain areas or to make a cool effect. We also experimented a lot with blowing air onto the alcohol ink as it was applied, to try and help the ink travel in different directions on the shell. We found that if we did it just right, the alcohol ink would spread into trippy patterns and look like everything from smears to little fat alien-like fingers. We used plastic straws for a while, but then I decided to up the ante and use a spray nozzle on my air compressor to see if that would work better, and oh man, did it create amazing patterns on the shells. I found that you have to have a little bit of a gentle touch here, lest you want to completely blow the ink off the shell and onto your art buddy. By far, one of my favorite effects was flinging the alcohol ink across the surface of the shell. Remembering my first grade art class, we also used an old toothbrush and a finger to spray a fine mist of micro droplets onto the shell. This ended up creating a very space-like vibe. All the tiny droplets of various size reacted with the ink underneath it, and it was truly a beautiful effect to watch live. It almost looked like a million small stars lost in a colored haze, with some in various stages of supernova. As we progressed, I learned about some of the challenges using this medium too. The more I worked with it, the more I realized that you need to be aware of a couple common issues in applying this to the drum as we did. If you set up a station as I have, using a right-angled wooden mount to hold onto the shell, you're going to be fighting against gravity a lot of the time. For some reason, if you drip too much near the bead of the shell, the alcohol likes to run together and it'll run right down and around the shell. I found that having someone on standby with an air compressor to blow in the opposite direction really helped mitigate this problem, but for the most part you need to be careful not to go a little too ballistic when working with a bead. Another thing to be aware of is that too much pure alcohol will take the ink right off your shell, which can sometimes be a bummer if you just spent the last 10 minutes getting the perfect shapes with your air compressor. The first shell ended up being a blend of just two colors, eggplant purple and lettuce green. One great tip I learned before we started was to always pick at least one light color and one dark color for contrast. If you pick too many of the transparent light colors, your finished project might be a little bit one-dimensional, and too many darks will consume the whole drum. That said, boy did this end up being a beautiful drum. We ended up calling this one Peacock Nebula. With that out of the way, the next drum was a wash of darker, greener colors mixed with heavy-handed use of aquamarine. We created a much more saturated look by using a lot more alcohol ink and not using as much dilution or speckling. The result was this really dark and mysterious looking drum, more reminiscent of a deep emerald lake surrounded by lush evergreens, or the northern lights washing the sky in a luminescent spectrum of ghostly greens that pierces the frigid night. We ended up calling this one Aurora Borealis. Lastly, it was my turn to finish my stray acrylite shell. You know, the one I almost completely melted and permanently destroyed? Yeah. I decided to go for a 3-color contrast versus 2 as I had done with the other shells earlier, and I picked cranberry, crimson, and a yellow color that I picked up somewhere. I wanted to go for a different feel here, so for this drum I used a lot of different inks mixed together and then blasted them with tons of compressed air. In this case, the colors were quite light, but still dark enough to create a wonderful contrast. The end result was something that reminds me of a rose-colored scorched sunset, something you see at the summer solstice when the sun meets the horizon. That's why we called this last drum Forest Fire. To finish up the drums, I coated them with about 4 layers of spray-on polyurethane. In my case, I chose the semi-gloss finish, as that's just what I had laying around. I tested a really small area first to see if the alcohol ink would react, but luckily for me, there was no reaction at all. After that, it was a piece of cake to finish the snares. It was just a matter of putting on the hardware again and tuning them up. For the first 2 snares, the badges were taped up during the entire process and left on the shells, and everything worked out fine. My snare, however, was just a bare shell with some hoops, so I had to get some new parts to finish the job. I could see a faint outline which looked very Keystone-like on the vent hole, so I presumed the snare was an old Keystone badge acrylite from somewhere in the 1960s. Even though I would have loved to have an original and appropriate badge for this drum, after a quick eBay search, I quickly decided I was not going to pay over $50 for an original badge. I know that nowadays you can get some really good reproduction badges for cheap, but at the time those weren't available. Luckily, I found a listing on an old Ludwig keychain made of some kind of brass, and I quickly bought it for a total of $5. And wouldn't you know that the hole inside the keychain fit the vent hole perfectly? I think that even though it wasn't an original part, it sure looked like it fit in well with the color scheme, and it gave the drum a unique character piece. After all, the drum itself was made of unoriginal parts, so I figured that one more wouldn't hurt. As for the throw-off, I ended up putting on an old WFL Ludwig throw-off that I'd had laying around. But between you and me, I ended up replacing this twice over the coming year. I stuck with the hoops I got when I purchased the shell, and opted for a brand new set of chrome tube lugs from Drum Factory Direct. This isn't just because I'm cheap, but I wasn't really in the mood to pay a premium for all the original parts off eBay. So finally, after all that work, here we have it, the final result. I think these snares turned out beautifully, if I do say so myself, each becoming its own little art piece. Peacock Nebula and Aurora Borealis ended up being returned to their rightful owners, but I held on to Forest Fire and ended up bringing it to Ireland with me to serve as my primary snare for several bands. I want to give a big thank you to my friends Wyatt and Brandon for trusting me and letting me Frankenstein their snare drums for internet video content. All in all, I would highly recommend you giving this a go if you're looking for a fun project and if you want to change the look of one of your metal snare drums that you otherwise don't care about keeping all original. The materials are relatively cheap, and you can save even more money by just getting 70% or stronger isopropyl alcohol from the local drugstore instead of buying the blending solution. All in all, my materials cost was less than $30, and as long as you're careful, I see no reason why you shouldn't have enough left over for several drums. What I really liked about the alcohol ink is that it was very reversible. If you don't like what you've created, you can easily erase it and you're all set to start over. Even if you regret doing this after refinishing, you could dissolve the polyurethane finish with a chemical stripper, and you would probably be able to return your metal snare back to its original state with fairly little effort. That's a lot easier and less of a commitment than if you would have used spray paint or spent a pretty penny to replate the drum. Anyway, that's about it for this one. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'm so happy to be finally finished with this video after 2 long years of waiting to make it. If you liked the video, please consider giving me a like and a comment. If you want to see more projects, I have a bunch of other videos where I repair, restore, and review drum parts and gear. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.